Welcome everyone. We hope you enjoyed the Journey and Halwa. I'm Nuala O'Sullivan from the Women Over 50 Film Festival. Maybe we've met before at Newham Community Cinema screening at Stratford Library, or maybe this is our first time meeting. Either way, hello and welcome. We're so glad that you could be with us this evening. Here's a description of me and what's on screen, if that helps you. I'm an older white woman with short white hair. I'm wearing a black top and I'm sitting on a tartan covered armchair in front of a bookcase. We've got Irina here from Sign for All, who'll be signing for us this evening. Hi, Irina. We're recording this session, so if you want, you can watch it again or share it with your friends. It's on demand on the Newham website at newhamlgbthistory.org, and it will be free forever. I'll run through how the next 30 or 40 minutes is going to go, and then we'll get started in our conversation with the director of tonight's short film Halwa, Gayatri Bajpai, who's with us here all the way from Vancouver in Canada. Gayatri and I will start off with a few thoughts about the journey, and then we'll dive into a discussion about Gayatri's own work and her delicate, moving short film, Halwa. We'll talk about her filmmaking, the reaction there's been to it in different communities, from South Asian ones to LGBTQ ones, and from people who belong to both those communities. And we'll talk about what makes a good LGBTQI ally and find out what projects Gayatri's got in the pipeline, even in the middle of a pandemic. We want you to join in the conversation too, so please put comments on both the films and any questions you've got for our guest in the chat, and we'll come to them later in the session. We'll wrap up our time together with some useful links from Gayatri so you can follow her work, as well as some links to some LGBTQI organisations that help and support queer people of colour and queer people of religion. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's guest, Gayatri Bajpai. Gayatri is a writer and director of narrative films and documentaries, as well as a producer and editor of non-fiction and reality pieces. Her short film that we saw, Halwa, won first place in the HBO APA Visionaries competition and was licensed by HBO on all its platforms. Other recent highlights include producing a documentary about legendary director Francis Ford Coppola's live cinema project, Distant Vision, and she's directed an anthology feature film called Rio. She was born in Delhi and lived there till she was 17, and now she lives and works in Vancouver. So let's kick off with the journey. This film was originally released 17 years ago in 2004, and this was the first time I saw it, and I thought it was amazing. In 2000, the director, Lgbtq had written some plays and some short films, and she was working as a lawyer in Chicago. She said, there was something of an epidemic of lesbian suicides in the South Indian state of Kerala. I wondered, what skills did I have? It's not like I could take my skills as an attorney and take them to India, but I did have this experience of making short films and writing and directing stage plays. So I thought, maybe I can make a positive representation of young gay people, and that would serve to break some of this isolation. At its heart, the journey is a story of love and tradition, the craving of acceptance from others around us, but ultimately the importance of accepting ourselves, no matter what others may think of us. The journey is the journey of becoming our own true self, and I absolutely loved it. So what about you, Gayatri? What did you make of the journey?
I absolutely loved it as well. This is the first time I've seen it, or found out anything about it actually. Um, and it was really touching and completely immersive. And I felt a certain sense of nostalgia for India and for the environment these girls are growing up in. And I thought the filmmaker did an excellent job of bringing that adolescent, that first love to life, um, against the backdrop of, you know, South Indian society. I thought it was really, really beautifully done.
Yeah. Um, sorry.
No, go on.
I was going to say that I love the landscape. I thought that was almost like a character in the journey. You know, the waterfalls, the swimming pool, the fields that we saw so often on their walks back and forth to school. And I thought that was really beautiful, and I thought it was a real contrast with the almost claustrophobic atmosphere of your film Halwa, which all took place in this one location. It was all shot inside, and we never got to see the main character Sujita outside the home. And I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about that contrast, if you can talk either about the journey and then about Halwa, and what did the location and setting mean to you in your film?
Right. Yeah, as I said, when I was watching The Journey, I felt a really close connection to it because the very sounds of the birds in the air and the kind of landscape that they were in, even though it's South India and I grew up in the North, I felt that sense of nostalgia, and also their connection as young women who are in love to nature. And nature plays an interesting role in the film to me because it both symbolizes their freedom, and at the same time there's a certain sense of secrecy, like they you know, they get lost in kind of the trees, and they have their private moments out there. So it was both, which I thought was very moving and interesting. And it, you know, completely accidentally, Halwa stands in total contrast to that. And I think The Journey is an amazing film, so I don't want to give myself too much credit here in the comparison. But in a sense, we are the spiritual sequel in a way, or you know, one could see it that way. Although I would love to
Totally.
I would
Yeah.
love to see what the filmmaker herself would make as an actual sequel to this beautiful film. But in a sense, we are, and we stand in total contrast. It was very intentional on our part to make um, Sujata's world feel, you know, claustrophobic, as you said, and um, definitely keep the outside world outside. Um, this was partly a film about somebody feeling trapped for most of it, and it was certainly very intentional. Um, so yes, it was an interesting, completely accidental contrast between the two.
Yeah. And where did the idea of Halwa come from? Because it didn't come from the journey because you hadn't seen it then.
Yeah, you know, it came from a few different places. It evolved quite organically. So the very initial seed of the idea came from our lead actress and executive producer, Vijaya's life. She and my co-director, Neerav Bhakta, a very talented actor and director, the three of us had known each other and been friends since my first year at film school when I cast them in a film of my own. And we'd kept up with Vijaya here and there over the years, and she'd been telling us about what kinds of roles she was going out for and just how unidimensional they could be as a South Asian woman over, you know, 40 or 50 in Hollywood. And she got quite vulnerable, first with Nirav and then with us, telling us about, you know, that she really wanted to make something that spoke to her experience. And so the very seed, as I said, of this film came from a brief but abusive marriage that she was in, that she got herself out of and had survived. And she was telling us about this, and the character of Sujata popped into our heads. And she wasn't necessarily Vijaya herself, but she was inspired by Vijaya, and there are concrete details from Vijaya's life in the film. But as we thought about it some more, you know, we fully intended to enter this film into the HBO APA Visionaries contest from the start. And the prompt there was about the digital era and connection in the digital era. So ironically, this film feels more relevant than ever right now.
Yeah.
But we realized as we started talking about our communities, especially the diaspora community, that there are a lot of people who back in India were pushed into unions that they didn't choose, straight and gay, across the board. And we began learning about how these people later connected over social media and might have left their marriages by then, a lot of them, and came back together, high school romances that came back together. So very quickly in our heads, that became kind of one of the catalysts in our short film, this romance. And the more we talked about Sujata, we also talked about instances in our own lives that we'd witnessed, people we loved. And Nirav told me this great story about his grandmother and her best friend in their village back in India, and how they had been children, best friends since childhood, like these two characters in the journey, this close, although it wasn't a romance in their case, but they lived across the river from each other with their separate households. And right into old age, they would make time every day to come out and say hello, even when they could no longer walk over to each other's homes. And so that image stayed in our heads as quite poetic and beautiful. And we realized that Sujata has a soulmate who was also her lover when she was a teenager. And that gave us Pramila, the person who she reconnects with when she gets her Facebook account in the film. So that's my very long-winded way of telling you the evolution of Halwa.
It's so interesting. It's so lovely that just one tiny idea can spark this whole short film. And similarly, we heard from the director, just she read this one news report about these a young woman committing suicide, and she dug into it, and it became a whole film just from reading about someone taking their own life. I mean, I think it's really interesting.
And so interesting that hers became such a hopeful story given the inspiration. I loved hearing where it came from and what it became.
Yeah. If there's one criticism of the journey, it's that there's not enough food in it for my liking, because I do like films with food in it. I really do. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the cake that's so central. What's in it? What does it taste like? How do you make it? Tell us a little bit about it, because it looks like it's the food of love to me.
That's a very good way of putting it. It's a very warm dessert, often eaten in the winter. And it's really, a halwa can be of many different kinds, but this particular one is gajar ka halwa, which is made of carrots. And it's grated carrots with, I believe, cloves and ghee, that clarified butter.
Mm-hmm.
And a ton of sweet, lots of sugar. And it really warms you from the inside. Raisins also. So it's a dessert that my grandfather made when we were growing up, and he still makes it the best that I've ever had. The way he made it is the best that I've ever had. And when Nirav and I were figuring out what it is she's making, you put it perfectly, it's the food of love. That dessert came into our heads as the perfect one that would express how she feels about someone, because it really does warm you from the inside.
Zoom is great, but I know for a fact if we were having this in real life, we'd have some really nice sweet treats to be eating just now.
That would be lovely.
I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the reaction to your film, because it's been out a few years and it's done super well on HBO and also on the festival circuit. Can you tell us about the different reactions from different communities, or just some stories about what people have said? I think it'd be interesting to hear specifically from South Asian people, from LGBT people, and maybe people who belong to both those communities. What kind of reactions have you had?
Yeah, it's been overwhelmingly positive. We've been very lucky. One might expect that there might be some resistance from, conservative members of the South Asian community. To be quite honest, that is something that we sort of went to it kind of apprehensive about. But, Nirav and I were talking about this yesterday, actually, And he's telling me that even from some of the most conservative members of his community, he found that people really liked it, you know, even older folks from the South Asian community. And it's actually had a good reception in India. It's played at queer film festivals in India. And it's played at queer film festivals all over the world, including Outfest in LA, which we were very happy about. And you know, we really, with the HBO competition, we really got embraced by the Asian community in Hollywood, and they gave us a lot of, they really helped promote the film. And so Asian community, South Asian community, and the South Asian LGBTQ community, and the LGBTQ community at large in the film world, we've had a great run. We're really happy. But I think one of the most rewarding experiences that I've had was when we were at the Seattle Asian American Film Festival. And there was a young woman who stood up in the audience and told us that her mother had recently gone through a very similar experience to sort of where Halwa ends, which is that she had come out of a long marriage to a man and had come out and embraced her queer identity and was finding community, which I think would be the next step. That's how I see what would happen after our short film, after that story ends, is she goes on to find community. Because within the film, as you might remember, there's a lack of that. She's very sort of sequestered and closed in. So yeah, we've been very happy with how it's been received.
Oh,
If anything, sorry, the one negative response we did after the film actually had nothing to do with the LGBTQ theme. It had to do with domestic abuse and portraying the community in a negative light. And it wasn't like a very harsh criticism, but it was a question of, why did you choose to portray us this way? And I think that's something I want to emphasize about the film, is we were not making a comment about the community at large, although obviously, you know, this takes place everywhere, but more, you know, the whole film takes inspiration from a specific person, and we mold a specific character. We are not saying anything at large about, you know, the LGBTQ community or violence. This is a specific instance and character that grew.
That's really interesting, and that's a perennial question. You know, if you create some art that's in some way critical, are you talking about all people? And you know, it's always that tension between the story you want to tell and being true to your story, and being able to say not all fill in the blank people are like this. Right. And it doesn't, I don't think it gets any easier. You know, it's a perennial situation and dilemma. Yeah. I read a quote, actually, you might be interested in a quote from the Journey filmmaker talking about the reaction to the film within India. The question was, has the film been shown in India, and what kind of response has it received? And she said, it's been really critically acclaimed in India. It won an award for India's best debut director, and that was a huge honor. And the interviewer went on to say, did you face any difficulties attempting to make a lesbian themed film in India? And she said, I instructed my entire cast and crew that if anyone approached them with a question as to what kind of film that you were making, they were just to say that it's a family drama. And so we managed to have our production schedule uninterrupted, thankfully. At a couple of screenings, there were people heckling and shouting, trying to stop the film from being screened. But if you see the film, you'll see that it's simply a love story. I didn't make the film for shock value. I made a film to relate a tale of true love, and that is all. And actually, that is really similar to what you've just said. You know, that they seem like very similar answers.
Definitely. I think that's the core of what we're all able to connect to in the film. That's the lightness and the hope and, you know, the brightness in her life. I think we can all, that's a universal emotion. That's what we tapped into as writers and directors. It's a love story by the end, you know, it's, yeah. And we actually, funnily enough, we think of it as a late coming of age love story, because they've had this huge gap and they come back together. In a way, it's kind of a rebirth for our character, which comes from Vijay's experience. In a way, she felt this new lease on life after that second marriage.
Yeah, yeah. I was going to say something there and I've just forgotten it. So
sorry.
No, don't worry. We always on this series of Q&As, we always like to ask our filmmakers, particularly if they're outside the LGBTQI community, we want to talk to them and want to talk to you about being an ally in your filmmaking. So I'd like to ask you, like, how important is allyship to you? And what did you learn about allyship in the making of Halwa? And is that going to have any influence on any future LGBT work that you do?
Definitely. It's something that, interestingly, the making of the film has made me think about differently. Because as a friend, I consider myself an ally to many people in my life. But the way I need to approach allyship as an artist is it's specific, and it's something that the very process of making this and putting it out into the world has informed a lot of. To be quite honest with you, when we were making the film, we were just so inspired and excited with the ideas coming into our heads and the imagery and news articles we'd read and people in the community. And all of these came together, and in what we felt was an organic process. We felt that through empathy, we could discover how this woman felt. And like you said, at its core, it's a love story. But I think after we put it out, and this happened within the space of about 3 months, a few years ago, the conception of and the making of the film. So it was really a whirlwind, and we didn't think very critically, to be quite blunt, about authorship. And that's something that we have reckoned with a little more, mostly privately, but to be honest. It hasn't come up that much. It's a question that you're one of the first people to really, engage with me on. As to what it means to portray someone from the LGBTQ community, in a nuanced and very specific way. And I think looking back on it, authorship is always important. It would have probably given us even more detail to have someone involved from the community, and ideally, an older woman who's been through a similar experience. So that said, I think going forward, I want to engage people behind the camera, especially in the authorship. I don't want to go to a place where I want to represent the world how it is. And I'm also, as an artist, I'm curious about other people's experience, how it overlaps with mine, even though it might be different. And so, if I want to be able to represent somebody in the future from the LGBTQ community, I want to do so with the input of a fellow author. I think that's been the big learning for me. And as a matter of fact, Nirav and I, we had started this documentary a couple of years before we made Halwa, actually. And it was very accidental. Nirav at the time was working at a motel where this trans woman, Natalie, a real force to reckon with, was living and working. She was a sex worker at the time. And she actually befriended him and started talking to him about her past. And he called me up and he was like, "You're the filmmaker, come over here, let's do this thing. Let's talk to her and get her story down, because she really wants to talk about it." And so we started shooting this documentary where she took the lead in telling her story. And so automatically, she is the author of this film along with us, which we're finishing right now. But lately we've realized that we need somebody who is also a creative, who understands the trans experience intimately, who can, look at this and really make sure that the way we're portraying it is just and nuanced to the community and how they want to be represented. So that's a first step, I think. Yeah.
That's so interesting. And we mentioned when we were talking earlier that we had screened Tangerine a couple of weeks ago as part of this series. So it's really interesting, because that was a kind of, that was an interesting hybrid of kind of, you know, it was drama, but a lot of the people were non-actors in it. So your documentary sounds really interesting. Have you got a title that we should be looking out for? Can you tell us
You
any
know,
more?
we named it after her. That felt like the simplest and most real thing. Yeah, we've named it Natalie. So we're actually planning to reconstruct some of her memories through animation. The great thing about this story is she is now a nurse saving lives in I won't say where she is. She's in the US, and she got herself off of drugs and, you know, out of a pretty bad situation in LA, moved, and she's become like this pandemic hero basically. So it's got a really neat ending.
Wow, that's fantastic. And is it like, is it a web series? Is it for TV? Is it, you know, is it short? I mean, what's the...
Short documentary at the moment. If we're working on funding, and if we're lucky enough, we hope to make something longer and get it in front of people. I'll keep you posted.
Oh, well, we'll definitely be looking out for that. It sounds interesting. Your journey as an ally filmmaker, you know, how you're evolving and progressing. I think that's really interesting. I think too, the idea that you can only write what you know makes for really boring film. I mean, eventually, I mean, I think most of us start by writing what we know, but eventually you've got an imagination for a reason. And it's about trying to get that balance of your own artistic voice and vision, and it being realistic, and it including people in the community, and particularly, as you say, where the roles are for people, and that there are roles for LGBT people in front of and behind the camera. And it sounds like you're really helping make that happen, which is great.
Thank you.
Working on it. It's about that time to go to audience questions. I'm not sure that I see any in the chat just now. So if you've got any questions, do pop them in there. Unless I'm missing something, Priscilla might send me a wee note to let me know that there is a question or two. But in the meantime, let me just see. Oh yes, there are, of course there are questions. I'm just looking in the wrong place. There was one question here which we've kind of touched on before, but there's a slightly different nuance, and it says, is it too dangerous to discuss LGBTQ issues in South Asian communities? And I guess you could maybe speak to that from a kind of North American perspective. Does it feel like it's dangerous are there any things that are kind of off limits?
I would say it's changing a lot. You know, of course, it's not something I constantly have to be aware of in my life, but from what I can tell and from seeing, especially up and coming artists, I know several queer filmmakers from India, based in India, who are doing amazing work, and it's being very well received. And just the fact that we got into, you know, these queer film festivals based in India, I wouldn't say, I mean, of course there are dangers still, and things evolve at a very slow pace, but I do think things are changing. I think the way that the younger generation looks at LGBTQ issues and talks about them is changing a lot, just from my experience engaging in social media and everything. So things are changing. And, you know, as a lot of people know, in 2018, same-sex relations were finally made officially legal in India, which is not to say that I didn't know people who were in relationships and living their lives to the fullest before, but just that recognition from the law is very important. So you know, the boring, or not the boring, but the long answer, I suppose, is that it really depends what community you are plugged into and how cosmopolitan or educated or less traditional that community might be. So I suppose it's like a lot of places that way. And India has a complicated relationship historically with, perceptions of the LGBTQ community. If you go far back into older Hinduism, there's a lot of nuance to the way that different types of relationships are described. But there's also a tendency in India, I think, to blame colonialism for certain laws that came into effect. You guys, the British.
Totally, absolutely, absolutely, yeah.
But
Yeah.
I've been reading here and there a little bit to get get myself educated, and there has, even within traditional Hinduism, older traditional Hinduism, there has also been, prohibition on certain types of same-sex acts and stuff. So, or relationships, like I think marriage was actually mentioned as something that shouldn't happen between specifically a man and a man in one text. So complex. Yeah. Like I said, there are some filmmakers who are doing a lot of interesting work. One person I would highly recommend actually is, and I went to school with her, she was a couple years younger than me, Karishma Dev Dubey, did a film, Devi, short film, which is about a relationship between a young woman and her family maid. And that's an incredible film and has been really well received. And then another film, Miss Man by Tata Gata Ghosh, about a trans woman in India and her identity. So lots of great work being done. People are talking about it.
If you have a chance towards the end, when I'm talking about some other links that are being put in the chat, if you're able to write the names of those two films and the directors, that would be really useful, because they're quite tricky to hear on Zoom.
I will.
Thank you. I'll let you know when we can get to that. Another thing that we've been talking about earlier that I think is really interesting, going back to the journey, is the kind of use of magical realism and the characters like the palm reader. Can you tell us a little bit about the kind of influence of someone like a palm reader and what her role was in the journey? Is she a kind of character that you associate with South Asian films?
Yeah, it's really interesting because she makes it feel like in a way, there's an acceptance of them and their love tied into her spirituality, and there's no judgment or questioning from her of that. And she, I think in a lot of people's minds within Hindu spirituality, she would be, you would almost see her as like a priest or something, like she would be more in the traditional side, I think. But in this film, she takes on kind of this, and I say witch positively, I like it. She takes on this kind of witchy presence, this magical presence that confirms that the way they are is the way they were meant to be, implicitly, if you know what I mean. It's their fate. And I think she says something like, "Do you know who you are?" to Kiran. And by the end, she's figured out who she is, or she's, gone. She's become very open with it. She's come back to herself. So I really liked that character, and I liked the tone of magical realism in general, because these two people are, and you'd asked me the other day about my mom, does she watch these films with me and what does she think? And she caught the second half with me, and she thought that there was something really warming and real about this adolescent, this first love feeling. Like she thought it was extremely touching. I think the magical realism really brought that out for me personally.
Interesting, talking about your mom there, because I'm from the Women Over 50 Film Festival. Every film I look at, I'm always kind of like, what's the older woman? What's she doing? How's she coming across? So of course I love the palm reader. But the other character who we really must talk about is the grandma, because
Yes.
she is such an ally, such a, she just loves her granddaughter so much. And I just thought that was a really beautiful relationship.
Yeah, and it, she's much more supportive in her own way. She can't quite make every problem go away, but in her own way, she's much more supportive than her own daughter, than Delilah's mother, which I found really interesting. And then any of the parents who are, you know, a generation younger than her. And, you know, I think you pointed out something really cool, which is she's at a place in her life where she's come probably, you know, a long ways through all the kind of societal constraints around her and realizes what's important. I thought that was a great point. I love that warmth and that relationship between the two. And I like that sometimes, you know, they're like, oh, don't tell mom, you know, go do this. I think I often had that relationship with my grandparents too.
Yeah, it's really nice. So tell us, please tell us, what is life like for you as a filmmaker in a pandemic? What's it like? What's the situation in Vancouver? You know, what are you up to? What's your everyday everyday life like? That's what I'm trying to say.
I got you. It's very indoors. I'm actually with my mother right now up here in Vancouver, and yeah, the two of us took quarantine extremely seriously. I have met maybe 3 people, you know, friends in the entire last 12 months. In some ways, I expected it to be a very productive time as an artist in the first few months, and a good 6 to 8 months flew by before I realized that I was just tired all the time, to be frank. And I hadn't done that much with the time. But over the last little while, I think with the light at the end of the tunnel, um, I've noticed among a lot of my filmmaker friends and in my own life, we're all springing into action. We're all making things happen. We're all finishing projects. So it was kind of this backlog that suddenly, you know, it's in sight. We have to finish up. We have to get ready to shoot things and send scripts out. So yeah, it was very indoor, internal. And I think for a while, that also gave a lot of us writer's block, and you know, we felt creatively stumped because you don't even notice how much taking a bus somewhere or going over to a friend's house and having a drink really influences. It's the input, you know, into you as an artist. It influences what you put out. Um, and I guess the last thing I have to say about it is, ironically, uh, Halwa feels like the moment, like a pandemic film, even though we made it before. Just the amount that I've relied on this kind of thing, Zoom and seeing people through a
Yeah.
screen is crazy.
Yeah, it's so interesting because when we played when we played Halwa at a WAF festival a couple of years ago, you know, it was a beautiful film and we loved it, and that's how we played it. And then when I watched it again recently, it just felt like such a pandemic film. Like they're on Zoom, and you know, it has a whole new life now in the world that we live. That's so true. I think did you say that you were part of a web series that you were working on just now?
Yeah, there's a local web series written by a really creative person. I would call it a Lynchian horror web series. And the interesting thing this creator did was ask a different director to direct each episode. So I'm one of the people directing an episode, and it's about a small town where there's something in the water. And so there's something happening to the characters. They're each losing their grip on reality in a different way, which I thought was fascinating and kind of metaphorical for what's happening perhaps to a lot of people right now, stuck indoors.
So have you actually directed that one, and did you direct it in the pandemic, or are you still due to shoot it, or where are you in the process of it?
You know, we wanted to shoot it in November of last year, and we had to put it off because numbers suddenly went up here. So we haven't shot it yet. But hopefully come April, things are starting to open up a bit more.
Oh,
And
that's
we'll be putting it out through Instagram. Actually, we're directly distributing it online.
oh, on Instagram. That's really interesting. And have we got a title for that we should be looking out for?
Currently, it's called There's Something Happening to Us.
There's something happening to us. Okay.
And my episode is called Rat Smith and His Mother. It's
Right.
about a mother-son relationship.
Okay. Interesting. Oh, there's we've got a question here, and it is, is the future for female filmmakers, sorry, is the future bright for female filmmakers of color?
I think so. I think the present is the brightest it's ever been for us. And, you know, there's a way people talk about it in the industry, and people who have benefited from privilege for a while. Like I mean, to be very frank, not to call this person out, but when I first got to LA and I was about to start film school a few years ago, there was an older man who basically said, well, it'll be easier for you now because there's a quota. They need to fill up their staff writer rooms in TV with women of color. And obviously, you know, it's not just like we're all graduating and getting hired because of the color of our skin or background or whatever. But I think this year's statistics of how many directors, how many female directors, and how many women of color, how many people of color worked is the best it's been in a while. I think from the 90s to the early 2000s, it had actually taken a dip, which was so depressing. And then recently it's actually built up again. But there's still a long way to go. And I think that's why, you know, I read a quote by a filmmaker, female filmmaker, who said, when she's working, she's not thinking about it, because to do so would be to put too much pressure on herself and be constantly aware of all the biases that she is up against. And granted, in your everyday experience as a female filmmaker and a woman of color, you are going to come up against biases inevitably. But when you're in the work, you're just in the work, and you have to make your own work happen as much as possible, which is something all indie filmmakers should do. And I think especially, you know, women of color, there's been so much amazing work. Like your own Michaela Cole, I May Destroy You. She is a powerhouse, and she's just come up with something that speaks to her and is directly from her heart and experience. And I think people, it really resonates with people once you get that work in front of them. So the cliche of being true to yourself and just making your own work happen is, it rings true to me.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. And yeah, we're I think pretty much everyone here is a fan of I May Destroy You. It's really fantastic example of making a specific story universal. And it does look like there is brightness in the future for filmmakers from underrepresented and marginalized areas. I just hope that after the pandemic, we can keep ahead of that curve, because of course the danger is, you know, there might the idea of films being in a safe pair of hands, which of course means who we know, you know, all those kind of things. I really hope that we've learned in the pandemic that actually we can do things differently, and we can make things online and accessible, and people can work from home, all these things that suddenly we could do when we wanted to. I really hope that comes through as we begin to come out of this pandemic.
And just to quickly add to that, I think also this idea of there can only be one from each kind of group, that needs to and is going away, and I hope that persists as well.
Yeah, if you're the only person of that, whatever group, older woman, woman of color, LGBT person in the room, it's not enough. Absolutely, absolutely. Before we go, don't forget to fill out the audience survey form. Priscilla has posted in the chat. And also in the chat, there's some information on the organizations involved in tonight's event. So that's the Newham LGBT History Month, Newham Community Cinema, Women Over 50 Film Festival, and Sign for All. There are also links in the chat about Gayatri and her work, as well as some links to some LGBTQI support groups that might interest you. There's a link to the South Asian LGBT plus support group, Gaysians, which is an umbrella brand for the South Asian LGBTQI plus community, which brings together resources, networks, and organisations related to being a queer South Asian person. There's a link there to Iman, which is a support group for LGBT Muslims. Iman was founded in London in 1999 to address the needs of Muslims who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And there's also a link to House of Rainbow, which fosters relationships and creates a safer community for Black, Asian minority, ethnic, and LGBTQ plus individuals and allies. This is the final week of these free online films and Q&As with Newham Community Cinema and Newham LGBTQI History Month. We hope you've enjoyed the films and our chats together. Thank you so much for inviting us into your homes this month. Happy LGBTQI History Month, and I hope we'll see you all in the real world one day soon. But for now, it's goodbye from our guest, Gayatri.
Thank you so much, Nuala.
And it's goodbye from Aruna and me. Goodbye.
Goodbye.